order in this hour privilege that we have. And it is a disturbing factor that I have experienced along with a number of others through a markup in the Judiciary Committee last week. And that is this dramatic departure from the rule of law, the dramatic departure from the Constitution, the dramatic departure from the understanding that criminal law in America would be focused on overt acts, not on the thoughts that we might divine would be within the heads of the perpetrators. And I'm speaking specifically, Mr. Speaker, about the hate crimes legislation that has been pushed through the Judiciary Committee and then will arrive here on the floor of the House of Representatives tomorrow. And by the way, the rules process that has taken place, there were a whole series of amendments that were offered in the Judiciary Committee. And those who watch the committee will know that the Judiciary Committee in the United States House of Representatives is the most polarized committee on the Hill. It's the committee that goes out and recruits I'll say the most hardcore left-wing people in this Congress to advocate for the most hardcore left-wing, and I'll say sometimes unconstitutional, often illogical proposals that might come before this Congress, rammed through the Judiciary Committee, not without a legitimate markup. I will concede that point to the chairman, Mr. Conyers. Many of us offered amendments, but a determination to vote down, shoot down, and defeat every constructive amendment that was offered before the Judiciary Committee on this so-called hate crimes legislation, Mr. Speaker. And as the legislation finally, on Thursday, after a full day Wednesday and most of the day Thursday markup, after that legislation on so-called hate crimes passed the House Judiciary Committee, it went to the Rules Committee, which met today, Mr. Speaker. And the Rules Committee's job is to also enhance something that is a responsibility of every chairman on this Hill, the responsibility of you, Mr. Speaker, and the responsibility of all of those who have a gavel in their hand. And I've spent some time with a gavel in my hand, Mr. Speaker. The job of the chairman is to bring out the will of the group. It's not to impose the chair's will on the group. To bring out the will of the group is the constitutional act of justice that should come from the hand that holds the gavel. But what happened instead? And perhaps, just perhaps, hate crimes legislation flowed out of the Judiciary Committee reflecting the will of the Judiciary Committee. But when it is filtered through the Rules Committee, the Rules Committee that sits in judgment upon whether there will be amendments that are allowed to be offered here on the floor of the House of Representatives or whether there will not, and which of those amendments might be offered, the Rules Committee has a profound responsibility to weigh the proposals and make a determination that this House can work in an expeditious fashion, but still reflect the will of the United States House of Representatives. That will has been frustrated, Mr. Speaker, because the Rules Committee, I'm told, has ruled there will be no amendments on this hate crimes legislation. That it'll come to the floor under a closed rule with no amendments allowed, only the amendments that were offered in the Judiciary Committee, and no other member of Congress. All of those who do not sit on the Judiciary Committee will have an opportunity to try to perfect this legislation that they call hate crimes legislation, that I call, Mr. Speaker, thought crimes legislation. That's at the core of our discussion here this evening, Mr. Speaker. And I'll submit that the will of this group, the will of the United States House of Representatives, is directly frustrated by the actions that I believe are directed from the Speaker's office, the actions of the chair of the Rules Committee, the actions of the majority members on the Rules Committee that have decided to shut down the amendments process and ram through a piece of legislation tomorrow with only 30 minutes allowed for all of the members of the United States House of Representatives to voice their objections here on the floor of the House of Representatives, and no amendments allowed, just a voice where there are more than 30 people lined up that would have less than a minute to add their words to this, and there's no chance to sway the opinion of this body. The opinion of this body that has locked in an idea that we're going to have hate crimes legislation in America that punish the thoughts of people who may or may not be perpetrating crimes against folks because of their particular special protected status that would be created under this hate crimes legislation. And I, Mr. Speaker, oppose and I defy the logic of the people that would advocate for such legislation, the very idea that we could divine what goes on in the heads of people when they commit crimes. And I will argue that the history of criminal law in Western civilization has always been about the overt act. Not about the covert act, it's about the overt act, not about the thought, not about what goes on in the head of the perpetrator, certainly not what goes on in the head of the victim. We recognize and have for millennia that the value of the victim is intrinsic in that each human life has a unique value that is priceless and sacred, whether it's a baby that's just conceived a moment ago, or whether it's someone in the last days or hours of their life. We're all that measure that life equally. In fact, former governor of Pennsylvania, Robert Casey, said, human life cannot be measured. It is the measure itself against which all other things are weighed. And yet this hate crimes legislation would weigh it differently. It would weigh the life or the health or the physical well-being of an individual that fit within these special protected status, the status that might be wrapped up in their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or their gender itself, of having a special status if it happens to fit the list of proclivities that they believe should be protected status. Now, when you start valuing one person's well-being, one person's life, different than that of another, we've deviated dramatically from the essence of criminal law and started ourselves down a path by which we're evaluating, not as the proponents of the bill, and I will say the gentlelady from Madison, Wisconsin, whom I specifically asked, is this a crime committed and is it evaluated by what's in the head of the perpetrator or what's in the head of the victim? And I think I might have misunderstood her, but they corrected me clearly, and they said, well, it's what's in the head of the perpetrator. All right? So if we're going to presume that a crime could be committed and we're going to enhance the penalty, maybe 10 years, maybe as much as life in prison for kidnapping, for example, because we're going to judge what goes on in the mind of the perpetrator at the time they committed the crime and what provided them the incentive for committing that crime. And we're evaluating here by law what goes on in the head of the perpetrator. But, Mr. Speaker, there's another component of this. This is what goes on in the head of the victim as well, because the special protected status rests upon not physical characteristics, not immutable characteristics, those characteristics that can be independently verified and cannot be willfully changed. No, Mr. Speaker, these characteristics are those mutable characteristics, those that reflect not just the physicality of the victim, but the attitude and what goes on in the head of the victim. So, for the first time, if this legislation should become law, the federal government will be punishing and acting upon legislation that presumes to be able to know what's in the mind of the perpetrator and what's in the mind of the victim, match those two things together and determine if a crime was committed, and if so, how to enhance the penalty. This is a bizarre thing, Mr. Speaker. This takes me back to the book 1984 by George Orwell, written in 1949, where George Orwell wrote, and I summarize this because I don't exactly have the quote in front of me, we don't care about the overt act. We don't care about any overt act. What we care about is the thought. Because if you can control the thought, you can control the overt act. And so why would we care about the act itself when we could control the thought? And by the way, we're not going to be satisfied if you just simply agree with us. You must do so willingly. We must bring your mind around to the point where you're eager to agree with us, and when that point comes, there will be no more overt acts that we disagree with, and therefore we will have controlled the mind, and by controlling the minds, we've controlled the actions themselves.
And I yield back the balance of my time.